It had a system built specifically to prevent this. Before re-entry, the reactor core was supposed to eject into a high, safe orbit away from any inhabited place on Earth. That system did not fire. In the pre-dawn cold of northern Canada, a live nuclear core broke apart in 70 seconds, scattering across 600 kilometers of frozen tundra. Some of what happened was disclosed within hours. Most of what it left behind is still being lived with. On September 18, 1977, at 13:55 UTC, a Cyclone II rocket lifted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, carrying a reconnaissance satellite into low orbit. In the West, it was catalogued as Kosmos 954. Its purpose was straightforward. It belonged to a Soviet program the West called Rorsat Radar Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite, built to track NATO and commercial vessels at sea, including submarines, using an active radar system powerful enough to illuminate ships from orbit. That radar needed continuous power. At the low altitude required to operate it, solar panels alone weren't enough, so the satellite carried something most spacecraft never do: a nuclear reactor. Ordinary reconnaissance satellites couldn't do what the Soviet Navy needed. Optical cameras were useless at night, through cloud cover, over open ocean. Radar solved that problem. But radar powerful enough to find a warship from orbit draws more electricity than solar panels can reliably supply at the altitudes required for a clear signal. A nuclear reactor was, by the physics of the problem, close to the only real option. The reactor was designated BESS 5. It weighed under 400 kilograms and generated roughly 100 kilowatts of thermal power, a fraction of which was converted into the electricity the radar needed. None of this, on its own, was unusual. The Soviet Union had already flown reactors like it in orbit before. What mattered was what was supposed to happen at the end of the mission. The reactor was built as a separable unit. Once the satellite's operational life ended, the plan was simple. The reactor core would detach and boost itself into a high disposal orbit, hundreds of kilometers above any populated altitude, where its radioactive material would remain safely isolated for centuries while it decayed. That was the plan. A system existed for exactly the scenario that followed. It was supposed to make what happened next impossible. Sometime in late 1977, Kosmos 954 began to fail. Ground controllers lost the ability to properly maintain its orbit. The commands to separate the reactor core and boost it into safe disposal altitude did not succeed. The satellite began to descend, slowly, at first, then not. A safety system engineered for precisely this failure mode simply did not activate. There was no backup for the backup. Once the primary safeguard failed, nothing else in the design stood between a live nuclear reactor and the ground below it. As the descent became unavoidable, the Soviet Union quietly informed the United States through diplomatic channels, providing details about the reactor and the risk of radioactive fallout on re-entry. The United States, in turn, warned its NATO allies and offered to help with any cleanup that might follow. The public was told nothing. For the people who would eventually live nearest to where the debris came down, there was no warning at all. Not from Moscow, not from Ottawa, not from anyone. At 11:53 UTC on January 24, 1978, 6:53 in the morning, Eastern Time, just before sunrise, Kosmos 954 entered the atmosphere north of the Queen Charlotte Islands and began tracking across western Canada. The Soviet Union's first public statement claimed the satellite had burned up completely on re-entry and posed no danger to anyone. That statement was false. Within 70 seconds, Kosmos 954 disintegrated across the sky, scattering wreckage along a roughly 600-kilometer path from Great Slave Lake to Baker Lake, crossing the Northwest Territories. what is now Nunavut, and reaching into northern Alberta and Saskatchewan. Some of what came down was radioactive, some of it was lethal to stand near. The first confirmation came almost by accident. A group of civilians on an Arctic expedition stumbled onto a large piece of wreckage lodged in the ice. A small crater burned into the surface around it. It wasn't military radar or a government sensor that found Kosmos 954 first. It was a group of people who happened to be in the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time. Canada and the United States launched a joint search operation. They called it Operation Morning Light. Search teams covered an area of roughly 124,000 square kilometers, larger than several small countries on foot and by air, in 2 phases running from January 24th through October 15th of that year. They recovered around a dozen large fragments. Most of them were radioactive. One measured 500 roentgens per hour on contact, a dose high enough to kill a person who stayed close to it for too long. In total, searchers recovered several thousand smaller pieces, adding up to roughly 65 kilograms of material. That sounds like a lot, until you learn what it represents. It was approximately 1% of the reactor's original fuel. 99% of a nuclear reactor core that fell out of orbit over Canada was never recovered. It is still out there somewhere in the Arctic wilderness, buried in snow, sediment, and lake beds that have had almost 50 years to bury it further. Aerial surveys using low-altitude radiation detection flew hundreds of passes over the suspected contamination zone, logging both physical wreckage and radioactive signatures too faint or too scattered to physically recover. Some of what they mapped was never retrievable at all, not because no one looked, but because the Arctic itself made looking impossible. A report published later that year offered a theory that still shapes how the incident is understood. That much of the reactor core had vaporized on re-entry, and that the resulting fine radioactive particles had settled disproportionately into the sediment at the bottom of Great Slave Lake itself. If that theory is correct, some of what fell from Kosmos 954 isn't scattered across the tundra at all. It settled into the water. While the search was underway, Canadian officials advised residents in the affected communities to report any metal debris they encountered and to stay away from it. Publicly, officials said there was little danger. Behind that statement was a scattered nuclear reactor core, several fragments of it lethal at close range, 99% of it unaccounted for, and a Soviet government that took weeks to answer basic technical questions Canada needed to protect its own search teams. Notes sent on January 24th, then resent on January 27th, then again on February 8th, then again on April 13th, went unanswered or were answered incompletely. The cleanup cost Canada nearly $14 million. The United States spent an additional $2.5 million assisting. A columnist writing in a Canadian student newspaper less than a month after the crash put the position plainly, that Canada, as the first nation to survive a nuclear satellite accident, had inherited an obligation to push for a world where this kind of payload was never launched over anyone's head without stronger safeguards than a single mechanical system that could simply fail to fire. In March of 1979, Canada filed a formal legal claim against the Soviet Union, invoking the 1972 Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by Space Objects, a treaty that had never before been tested by one sovereign nation seeking compensation from another for damage caused by a falling space object. It was the first case of its kind in the history of spaceflight. Negotiations did not begin for almost a year. When they did, they moved slowly 3 formal sessions across February, June, and November of 1980. Canada's claim totaled just over $6 million in cleanup costs. On April 2, 1981, in Moscow, a protocol was signed. The Soviet Union agreed to pay Canada 3 million Canadian dollars, roughly half of what had been claimed in full and final settlement. The agreement did not include an admission of legal liability. It mattered anyway. Before Kosmos 954, there was no precedent for what one country owed another when its space hardware fell somewhere. It was never supposed to. The Outer Space Treaty had always said that a launching state bears responsibility for damage its objects cause. Nobody had ever actually forced the question. Canada did. And a superpower, however reluctantly, however incompletely, paid. It was not the full amount claimed. It was not an apology. It was, by the account of the officials who negotiated it, the best deal available. Considerations of prolonged negotiation, political reality, and precedent weighed as heavily as the actual cost of the cleanup itself. Half of $6 million was the price attached to a live nuclear reactor scattered across a foreign country's Arctic territory. The incident did change something. Eventually, the unplanned re-entry of Kosmos 954 became the case study that pushed the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space to finally act on a question it had circled since 1972. What happens when a country puts a nuclear reactor into orbit and loses control of it? It took 14 years. In December of 1992, the UN General Assembly adopted the principles relevant to the use of nuclear power sources in Outer Space 11 guidelines, calling for safety assessments before launch, mandatory notification if a re-entry risk arises, and formal recognition that a launching state is responsible for the damage its reactor causes on the ground. They were not legally binding. They were, and remain, the only global answer the world has produced for a problem that Kosmos 954 created in 70 seconds over the Canadian Arctic. 50 years on, nuclear power sources are still flying. Deep space missions depend on them precisely because solar power fails once a spacecraft gets far enough from the sun. Proposed lunar reactors, meant to power future bases, are being designed under safety frameworks that trace their lineage directly back to the 11 principles written because of what happened over the Northwest Territories in 1978. The trade-off Kosmos 954 represented surveillance and power, purchased against the risk of an uncontrolled re-entry, has never actually gone away. It has only ever been managed a little more carefully since. For the people who live nearest to where it came down, careful management after the fact was never quite the same as prevention. The Den communities along the eastern shore of Great Slave Lake did not choose to test a Cold War surveillance program's failure mode. They were simply already there. On land their families had lived on for generations, when a piece of someone else's satellite came down through the sky above them. Decades later, the story of what happened is still being told back to them, and by them in oral histories. In conversations about cancer rates that communities describe as higher than they should be, without any official study ever having fully closed the loop on cause and effect. What is certain, and documented, is this: the search recovered roughly 1% of the reactor's fuel. The other 99% was never found, not because the search stopped trying, but because an area of 124,000 square kilometers of Arctic wilderness is simply too vast and too unforgiving to fully search. The reactor is still out there. It has been for almost 50 years. Somewhere beneath the snow, or the permafrost, or drifting in the sediment of a lake that people still fish and still call home. The scattered remnants of a nuclear reactor core built by a government that no longer exists are quietly finishing what started in September of 1977. No one has ever gone back to finish looking for it.